Well, I'm so excited to introduce to our audience today Dr. Fleet Maull, author and renowned growth mindset and meditation teacher who delivers his training programs and seminars around the world, both in person and online. Dr. Maull is an executive coach, inspirational speaker, and social entrepreneur who works at an intersection of personal growth and social transformation. Welcome, Dr. Maull.
Great to be here. Nice to meet you, Lindsay, and thank you for having me on your show.
Thank you so much for your time today. I think to just start this off and get the most inspiration out of our message today, we need your backstory.
Okay, well, I'll try to do that very briefly. I grew up in the Midwest and came of age in the 1960s, so I'm a baby boomer. Grew up kind of a classic angry young man, big hole in my gut due to alcoholism and other issues in my family. Basically, good family, good values, but some real problems with alcoholism and that was kind of very splitting and kind of my psyche, a big hole in my gut. I was kind of a classic angry young man, but I was also always a seeker. I was a psych major in college, as well as business and psychology, and grew up in kind of a small business family. And but went headlong into the counterculture and all the craziness of that era. I ended up living as an expat for a while, fell into small time drug trafficking, smuggling as a way to live outside the system, justified that with all this us versus them thinking. Along the way, I had continued my spiritual seeking and gone back and got a master's degree in Buddhist and Western psychology, a 3-year clinical training program. Studied intensively with my first Tibetan Buddhist teacher and was trained as a meditation teacher, all that. So I had this kind of split life going and kept the shadow secret life secret from my teacher and my community. And, I knew I had to get out of it. And I was self medicating around the cognitive dissonance and all that. So at any rate, in 1985, I ended up in a federal prison on drug charges. And I originally had a 30-year no parole sentence. I pretty much thought my life was over. I was 35. The paper the next morning said I'd be 64, 65 before I have any chance of release. And my son was 9 years old at the time, and I just hit a wall. I was absolutely devastated, a real dark night of the soul, having to face what I'd done to him and to his mother and what I'd done to myself in my own life and really acknowledging all the incredibly selfish decisions I've been making for so long, putting his life at risk, his mother's life at risk. And so I became really dedicated to getting all the negativity out of my life and really focusing on taking all I'd received from my family and from my teachers and all my training and doing something good with it. And I ended up in this really hellish environment of a maximum security federal prison hospital in the height of the AIDS crisis. And so I just started showing up and serving. And I got a job teaching school. That was my day job. But I got very involved in my own 12-step recovery, dealing with my own substance abuse and alcohol issues. I led a meditation group in the chapel for 14 years. And I helped start the first hospice program in a prison anywhere. Most of my extra time on meal breaks and evenings and weekends was spent up in the hospital taking care of men who were dying. And that was incredibly transformative work. It ended up being 14 years, so between 1985 and 1999. But this was kind of my monastery time, my ashram time. I was just radically dedicated to transforming myself. And it was a hellish environment, but I had enough background and training and was able to really focus on meditation practices and contemplative life and study. And so it became a very, very powerful chamber really for transformation for me. And I actually, built a good life for myself in there, even though day to day it was a very demeaning place. And so it was a very negative environment, but I developed an inner resilience to where I lived in a really pretty uplifted state of mind. But, I was practicing 2, 3 hours a day. I was really intensely practicing various contemplative practices, studying deeply and so forth, and living this life of very disciplined life of service and taking good care of myself and so forth. So I knew I'd be almost 50 when I got out. Very tough to start a life when you're 50 and you got a criminal record. And knew I would be in debt when I got out because of IRS assessments against me. So I knew I had to work really hard, and it did pay off when I got out. I've had nothing but opportunity ever since. But the radical responsibility model, with the name of my book, was really born in that prison because when I got to that federal prison after 7 months in this hellhole of a county jail, it's kind of a relief getting there. It was a big place. I could get a job. There were recreational areas. It was a yard. You could walk around. I was very caught up in the drama of my own situation. But when I got there, this place was such a place of suffering. So in that light, it really just began to radically change my life from the beginning. But the other thing I realized right away that it was a world of tremendous negativity. Like there was kind of a ritual when you'd meet a prisoner, right? You'd meet somebody and you'd go out, walk the track, a meal break or something, and they tell you their victim story, you tell your victim story, right? My fault partner just screwed me over, my lawyer screwed me over. This everybody's got a big victim story, and everybody
Mhm.
feels victimized by the system, and after going through that ritual once or twice, I didn't want to hear my story anymore. I really didn't want to hear their stories, which wasn't very compassionate, but it's just I didn't want to live there. And I realized that if I wasn't really proactive, I could live in prison and come out of prison bitter and angry and I didn't want to live that way there. I didn't want to come out that way. And I knew that I had to embrace 100%, 200% responsibility for having got myself into that situation, for what I was going to do with it and what I'd be able to create with my life going forward. If I survived, I had no surety that I would survive my time, but I knew that if I was able to return to the world, what I was going to be able to do with my life was completely up to me. So that's really where I developed this approach of radical responsibility and taking radical ownership for each and every circumstance I was facing. And that approach actually allowed me to create a lot of good while I was there. I started all kinds of programs while I was there in the prison. And I also started two national organizations. One, the National Prison Hospice Association, which took our hospice model and got it out in the world. So now there's probably 75 or 80 hospice programs in state and federal prisons around the country, as well as some around the world. And then I started an organization to support prisoners interested in mindfulness and Buddhism and Dharma and things like that, which today is a flourishing nonprofit known as Prison Mindfulness Institute. All that came out of not focusing on blame, not blaming myself, not blaming others, not demonizing anybody there, my fellow prisoners or the staff, but just trying to relate with people. How can I relate with people to get things done and move things along and not get caught up in all the drama, but just take ownership for each and every circumstance? And that's served me really well. So that's where that was born. So that was kind of long, but it's a long story.
No, I feel like it's 100% needed. And if you can come out of a situation like that, taking 100% ownership, I feel like our listeners can transfer that over into anything, right? I think that when I think ownership of a situation, it's easier. I actually was just having a conversation even with my daughter this morning. It's easier to think of ownership in a situation where it really isn't our fault, but maybe we
Right.
need to take ownership of it. But I don't know, it transfers over into everything. Like it can be a prideful thing. Like what are the barriers that you see for people not being able to take ownership?
Well, there are a lot of barriers, and I'll go into some of those. But first of all, I want to clarify that this idea of radical responsibility or ownership has absolutely nothing to do with blame. It clearly has nothing to do with blaming others. And it has not even one iota to do with blaming ourselves. It's not about blaming ourselves, and it's certainly not about blaming victims. It's about how we work with ourselves in our own situation. And so we can find ourselves in a circumstance we're not happy about, and we can, really take a good look at that and see, is there any way I contributed to that or allowed it or just wasn't paying attention? Like, what's my part in this? And we look at that not to blame ourselves, but only for the process, for the purpose of learning, for insight. Because if I got, from point A to B to C and I don't like C, well, if I can understand how I got there, I can make different choices next time and get different results. So I look into it, get radically honest about my contribution to circumstances I find myself in only for the purpose of learning so I can create something different in the future. It has nothing to do with self-blame. And then we'll find such circumstances where we can't see we had anything to do with it, where they just seem to fall out of the sky and land on our head. And everybody would agree that, no, you had nothing to do with it. You're completely innocent. This just happened to you. It shouldn't happen to anybody. Even those circumstances, I encourage and I work with in my life to embrace 100% ownership. So what does that mean? It's again, it has nothing to do with blame, but I'm owning my choices at that point because whatever circumstance we're in, at some point, the most salient question, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to let this take me down? Am I going to stew in a victim mindset forever? Am I going to, or am I going to find the most creative way I can to move my life forward, to respond to this in the most creative way that's a win-win for myself and others. So what's the most creative response to this? Now, we're all human. We're going to find ourselves feeling victimized. We're going to find ourselves kvetching about things. And in some cases, people are terribly victimized. And I'm not being dismissive of that at all. And they may need to have that validated for them and be supported in that. But, I think we can all see if somebody stays stuck there, at the very least, it's going to be very understandable. And it can be heroic to move beyond that, some of the horrible things that happen to people. But if we do remain stuck there, it's going to be very limiting for our life, right? So this is really about how can we find our way, cultivate the resilience to be able to face the tough circumstances of our life. And instead of focusing on who I can blame or feeling victimized, well, what can I do? We call what can I do radical responsibility question. It immediately gets us out of any kind of, blaming or sense of victimization into the world of possibility. Because the minute I think, what can I do? There's always a million things I can do. There's a million different ways I can approach any person, any situation, work with myself. So that's the first thing, to understand the distinction between ownership and blame. This has nothing to do with blame. Then, in terms of the obstacles, one of the biggest obstacles is just we're creatures of habit. So we're highly programmed, and most of us don't realize how highly programmed we are by our early childhood conditioning, and then all the influences that have been conditioning us forward. And this is psychological conditioning, but it's literally programming in our brain. Our brains are programmed. There are neural networks in our brain that, it's sort of like, maybe, we drive home the same way every day from work, and we have that exit we get off in, and that's the way we go home. But one day we're supposed to go somewhere else, right? But we find ourselves driving off the exit before we realize it, right? Because we have a neural network in our brain that can get us from work to home without us really being very attentive. It's literally a neural pathway in our brain. And so this stuff gets deeply programmed into the brain. So one thing is to realize we're up against that, and we actually have to work to change that. We have to develop the awareness to recognize our programming, to recognize our emotional triggers that can get us going down certain paths. We have to do the work to really understand ourselves better, and then understand how to gradually change those programs and how to reprogram ourselves in order to move in the direction we want to. Another thing is, basically we live in the interface between our childhood programming and the world around us. And we tend to think we're free, autonomous, free thinking adults walking around making autonomous, free thinking decisions all day. But it's not true. We're very mechanical, very habit driven creatures. And basically, stimulus A1 comes in, we respond with response B2 every time. We're very mechanical in that way. And so, we're in there in life kind of just getting pushed around by the interface, the reaction between the circumstances we're in and our childhood conditioning. And it's going to be that way until we change it. And it doesn't have to be that way. We can develop the awareness to take responsibility for being in a responsive relationship with life rather than a fear-based and an unconscious reactive relationship. And that really begins with learning to manage our own physiology. That's where it all starts, learning to manage our own physiology. Because, we all know that we get stressed out and emotionally triggered. So we have a autonomic nervous system that either gets upregulated or downregulated. It has these two branches. Sympathetic branch is alertness, then stress, and then out of control, upregulated. And the parasympathetic branch is relaxation and going to sleep. And they're both happening all the time. And they're connected with the in-breath and the out-breath. When we breathe in, slight upregulation. When we breathe out, slight downregulation. So we can learn to use our breath and various breath work techniques to regulate our own physiology. And that's where it really begins. Because until we take ownership for regulating our own physiology, it's being regulated by the world around us and driven by our conditioning. And that keeps us locked in to all of our habitual programs. So the real doorway to freedom starts with learning to regulate our own autonomic nervous system.
So it's interesting how much emphasis you're putting on it and how little people try that, or how little people dive in with that same belief that it's going to make that much of a difference. Because I feel like we've all heard our breath work is so important, or meditation is incredibly important in our journeys of whatever. But I live kind of in the health land here. So a lot of our talk is around health and fitness. What is your talk around, like, if somebody's going, they're willing to work out, they're willing to eat healthy, and then they never think about okay, I really should be meditating. I really should be thinking of my breath work. Like, do you feel that they're missing this whole side of the equation that could be benefiting them?
Well, if they are working out, if they are eating healthy and that's all working for them, that's all fine and good and wonderful. But most of us know that despite our best intentions, we don't do the things we know that are good for us. And we're constantly breaking any kind of diet or regimen that we can't stick to them. It's very difficult, right? And that's because of all this habituated programming and the influences of the world around us, because the world around us, the media and everything is constantly trying to, suck us into whatever they're trying to market, right? So, most of us really struggle. If somebody, doesn't struggle with that and they're just able to do what they intend to do all the time, well, bless them, right? They're a unique individual, right? But most of us struggle. And, uh, and so the ground is really developing self-understanding and developing insight into that. And, really, this doesn't have to be hard. Like there's a very simple breath work tool. I'll share with you right now. It's simply called straw breathing. It's called straw breathing because you can do it with a straw, like you could breathe through a straw, right? But you don't need a straw. You just breathe in through the nose and then you breathe out through pursed lips as if you're breathing through a straw, right? So it's like you're whistling. So by pursing your lips, it's a little harder to get the air out, right? So it creates a little effort. That has a physiological effect. And then we want the out breath to be twice as long as the in breath. So you might breathe in a 4 count. In 1, 2, 3 through the nose, and then out through pursed lips. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like that. So the out breath twice as long as the in breath. You're breathing in through the nose and out through pursed lips. And if anyone does that for even a minute, much less 2 minutes, you'll feel your nervous system just calm right down because that's engaging the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which is more related with the out breath and is that calming effect, right? If you were too sluggish, you need to get upregulated. You can do this quick abdominal breathing with, it's kind of like almost like hyperventilating, but shallow breathing through the nose using your abdominal muscles. So really fast like that, and it'll wake up your nervous system. So those are two simple things that, and it seems really simple, but I train people in this all the time and they're just blown away because they didn't realize they could regulate their own nervous system. And if we don't regulate our own nervous system, who's regulating it? Everybody but us, right? And that's what allows us to just doing that kind of thing on a regular basis. First of all, when we do find ourselves getting really stressed out and triggered, which usually leads to behaviors that are not so healthy and in our own even enlightened self-interest, we can get ourselves untriggered really quickly just doing something like straw breathing. So it can be a lifesaver in that way. But doing it on any kind of regular basis, and there are other things that you can earn, like 4-7-8 breathing that Andrew Weil popularized, box breathing. There's these very simple techniques. They put us more in sync with ourselves, and in general keep us in a more aware state where we're going to make better decisions. And then if someone's willing to practice some mindfulness, and mindfulness is really simple practice in principle is we place our attention somewhere with the intention to keep it there. And when we notice the mind wanders, we bring it back. The mind wanders, we bring it back. Every time it comes back, it's like we're doing a rep. And we're building the strength of focus, concentration, and mindfulness. Mindfulness is a skill we all have. You couldn't live without it. What we know scientifically is you can have a lot more of it, and that benefits our life across every dimension, gives us more emotional balance, more cognitive control, enhances our immune system. It helps us live longer. I mean, just incredible benefits. The research on mindfulness is incredibly compelling. The most common object of mindfulness that we place our attention on is simply the body and the breath. So we might just sit here, we might have our eyes down a little bit so we're not distracted, and just focus on feeling the breath going in and out. And inevitably, we'll get distracted. We'll get lost in thought. We recognize that, we let it go, we come back to the breath. Try again, stay with the breath, stay with the breath. We get distracted, we come back, stay with the breath, stay with the breath. Very simple practice. You can do it in a concentrated way, 5, 10, 15 minutes sitting down. But you can also start bringing mindfulness into anything you can do. You can be mindful while you're washing the dishes or while you're walking the dog instead of just spacing out. When we're not actively directing our mind, directing our attention, what do you think is directing it? Well, it's just past conditioning. We know a lot about the brain these days, and we're learning more all the time. There's a network called the default mode network, and it has its purposes, its evolutionary purposes, and even its present day purposes. But for most of us, our default mode network is way overactive. And this is the very noisy, discursive part of our brain. It likes to time travel and go worry about the past, ruminate about the past. It likes to go into the future and worry about the future or fantasize about the future. It keeps a running commentary going about the present. It's forming all of our opinions. We're thinking about ourselves, what other people think about us. It's the noisy part of the brain that reinforces the constant sense of a small, separate self, which is a big source of our suffering, and it creates all our stress. Well, when we focus our attention, that engages something called the task positive network, different network in the brain, and these are mutually inhibitory. So to the extent that we focus, the mind quiets down, right? And we're not generating all that stress. I mean, we all know if we do something as simple as trying to thread a needle, right? For that moment at least, our mind's going to get really quiet, right? And that's because we're engaged in the task positive network. So by being more mindful in our life, whether we're mindfully walking, mindfully driving our car, or practicing formal sitting mindfulness practice, mindfulness of breathing, that's spending time with the task positive network engaged. So the mind quiets down. We're not creating all that stress. We're not reinforcing a sense of a separate self, and we're developing just greater resilience and tremendous possibilities of healing our trauma and developing deeper and deeper resilience. So with the challenges of the life, we can be there and respond in a responsive way, in a relational way, instead of getting pushed back into that fear and survival reactivity with life. We can stay more on the balls of our feet and be in a relational, responsive mode with life, where we can create good relationships and create good outcomes in our interactions with others.
Oh, this is so good. And I feel like deep too. So I'm gonna bring it a little more shallow and put you on the spot almost with case study of let's take that stressed out mom who starts her morning hectic. Kids get up, there's grumpiness going on in the house. By the time she gets the kids out the door, she's frazzled, running off to work, wanting to be healthy, didn't pack her lunch, gets home, still feels like take how if this client walked through your door, what would be some of your talk or your once goal setting, all of that with this type of a client?
The first thing I would introduce to them, to such a person, is breath awareness. Because breath awareness can be done the minute you get up. It can be done while you're getting the kids together, getting them dressed. It can be done while you're making breakfast. It can be done while you're driving. It can be done while you're racing. It's just developing a habit. It's just a habit. It takes a little practice, but it's not that hard to develop. Of just being more in your body and more aware of your breath. That'll slow you down. You'll actually more efficiently be able to get the kids up and make the breakfast and get them out the door and get yourself out the door. You'll do that all more efficiently because you're more in your body and you're calmer. And so it's just about feeling the body and feeling the breath. And when you find yourself racing or getting too, you just straw breathe. And you can do it while you're doing things. You don't have to stop and go, in a cave and do straw breathing. You do it right in the midst of your activities. And it's really magical. It's powerful. I teach this to correctional officers, right? I spend a lot of time training police and correctional officers these days. And, they work in really high stress jobs and constant exposure to chronic stress, to both primary and secondary trauma. The life expectancy for a correctional officer that works in a medium to high level security facility for more than 20 years is 58 years. They're dying 2 decades earlier than everybody else, right? From all the chronic stress related ailments, from suicidality, from obesity and addictions, and because they're under a constant state of chronic stress because they don't know how to manage what we're talking about, and what they're exposed to is just horrendous in terms of the level of primary and secondary trauma. So I teach them all this breath work and mindfulness, and they just soak it up like a sponge because the breath work, learning something as simple as straw breathing, they start using it immediately in a work situation, and they find it gives them just that little bit of freedom, that little bit of space to how they can respond instead of just feeling like they're just constantly being pushed around and everything. So that's really the key, is beginning to get in relationship with our own body and our own physiology so we can feel. We've been really enculturated in modern life to not feel. So everybody's taking all kinds of prescription meds and distracting themselves with TV and the digital tools and everything else so we don't have to feel. We have the worst opioid crisis in history because people don't want to feel. Well, it's completely counterproductive to not feel. We need to feel, but we need to be able to feel without being overwhelmed by our feelings. And that happens by being grounded in the body, doing breath work. Then we can be feeling all the time. And And then we're not going to get so hijacked by strong emotions because we're always more in touch with our emotions and our body and so forth. So it's really having simple practices to get in the body, be in the body, feel the body, be more present, and use simple breathwork tools to help manage our own physiology. So when we're getting too upregulated, we can bring it right back down.
Thank you. Yes, beautifully said. And I have a question for you. Is this a segue into growth mindset is another word that you used often. Can you kind of tell us where does growth mindset come into play with all of this?
Absolutely. And by the way, I just want to let your listeners know, I mean, they can check out my book, Radical Responsibility. But if you want to learn about breath work, just go to your search engine and put in straw breathing, put in 478 breathing, put in box breathing. There's tons of material, YouTube videos. It's just so readily available. You can just go learn it right now. It's right there on YouTube. There's tons of instruction about it. If you're nerdy and want to learn the neuroscience about it, behind it, it's all on there as well. But this is just so available. So it's available to anybody, just like that. Just put it in your search engine, straw breathing, and you'll find out how to do it. Growth mindset is really, it's very similar to this idea of ownership. Now, growth mindset, Carol Dweck's work, it's been, really influential in the field of education. It's the opposite of a limited mindset where I think, this is just the way I am. Like I'm only this smart, I'm only this talented. This is what I know. This is going to be my life. It's a limited mindset, right? And they see that children who have a limited mindset because of whatever influences, they don't do well in school. And if they can help them shift to a growth mindset, well, no, I can learn and I can improve. I can get better at this and I can get better at math. I can get better at writing. I can get better at a sport. I'm a growing being. There are really no limits. If I'm willing to apply myself, I can always get better at anything and everything. Right. And so that's the growth mindset. The growth mindset is that, life is very malleable. It's very changeable. Like I can learn anything that I apply myself to. I can really do anything that I apply myself to. Some people are more inherently talented around certain things, maybe born with certain genes or something. If you're under 6 feet, you're probably not going to play in the NBA. There are some limitations, but the limitations pale in comparison to the possibilities in our life. Any of us can really learn to do anything that we want to apply ourselves to. It's really completely up to us. And that's the growth mindset. And that comes back to the idea of radical responsibility, radical ownership of, just owning my own destiny. These are not new ideas. Marcus Aurelius, who was considered the last great Roman emperor, and he was a Stoic of the Stoic philosophy. And he has a wonderful book of his kind of called Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. It's a lot of these short sayings of his, which I encourage people to check out. But kind of paraphrasing one of them, it was something like, most people feel like their destiny is determined by their circumstances, that their destiny is determined by the circumstances. So in today's modern, it could be the zip code you grow up in, or if you grow up in a poor neighborhood or in poverty, or if you your skin color, and it's not that these things don't have influences. They can create real challenges. And we should all be working to make the level of playing field and make ideally everyone have as equal of an opportunity as possible. But regardless of circumstances, we can all grow and we can all move forward. It is really up to us. And what Marcus Aurelius said, it's not that our destiny is determined by our circumstances. Our destiny is determined by our response to those circumstances, what we do with those circumstances. And everybody knows the truth of that. Everybody knows it intuitively. But we're really enculturated in a different direction. Our culture is really reinforces victim mindsets in major ways today. And our culture is also full of blame and shame. And it's unfortunate. There's a lot of good values in our culture, and everything I'm talking about. You can find it everywhere in the culture. Historically, you can find elements of it. But we also embrace this kind of what I think is a sad twist on Christian theology, the more Calvinist view of that human beings are basically flawed and have this depraved nature. And absence some coercive threat or coercive force, we won't behave well. We're essentially dangerous, right? And that's a very negative view of humanity. And it's not that it hasn't been historically been the agreed upon view throughout cultures all over the world. The much more dominant view is that we're inherently good, that we have innate goodness, innate wholeness, and it's really It's fear that gets in the way, right? You know, even if you look at what do most human beings all over the planet do every day? They get up, they do their best to take care of themselves, to take care of their kids. They drive on the right side of the road. They queue up at the well. We're highly cooperative and collaborative until fear sets in. And if enough fear sets in that we can't get our needs met, then we may start behaving in some really untoward ways, right? So if we want a more workable society and a more, enlightened society, we need to remove as much fear and have people have greater assurity that they can get their needs met. But so we all want to work collectively to create a better world in that way. For every one of us individually, it's really up to us. And I'll give you an example of that. I teach in prisons, right? So when I go into a prison, I want the prisoners to get that I really get that most of them have been terribly victimized in their lives. I mean, most people end up in prison, and I've done a lot of trainings and deep group work in prison, and you find out the vast majority of people who are in prison have suffered from severe abuse in their childhood, severe physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, or all three. They've been literally programmed to end up in prison. So when I go in, I want people to know that I get that. I also want to know that I get that our criminal justice system is highly unjust, that it's highly racist, whether by default or by design, but it's highly racist. And, that a lot of them have been, victimized in so many ways their whole lives. I want them to get that. I get that. I also want them to get that I'm brokenhearted to see any of my fellow human beings behind bars. So I really want them to get that. And they do get that because that's who I am. I also want them to get that where they're going to be able to go with their life has nothing to do with anything other than the choices they're making today and tomorrow. That their destiny is totally up to them, regardless of all the past, regardless of all the victimization, regardless of all the circumstances, for which we all want to bring tremendous empathy and compassion, but it's still up to them. Their destiny is going to be based on the choices they're making today and tomorrow and nothing else. And, if they want to change the world and have a more just world, well, then get your life together, get out of prison, go out there and change the world, but do it from a place of empowerment, not from this place of, of a victim mindset or a sense of entitlement. Today there's this kind of sense of entitlement that the world's supposed to be a certain way and it's supposed to be, just, and it's supposed to be this and it's supposed to be that. And well, all those things are good. We want all those things, but the world's not supposed to be anyway. I mean, the world is what it is, and none of us are entitled to anything. The human race, slithered out of the swamp, whatever, millions of years ago. It's evolution. It's a brutal process. And life is only going to be as good as we make it collectively and individually. So it's up to each and every one of us to work every day to do that. But we don't need to feel bad about humanity. We're actually doing really good. Things are better than they've ever been, despite all the terrible problems we have. All you got to do is have a historical perspective and see how even more terrible it was in the past, right? So, we're actually doing really well. But it's up to each and every one of us. But we can do that out of a sense of aspiration rather than that we're somehow entitled to this. We're not entitled to anything. I mean, I believe in human rights and all that. And these are collective things that we make collective agreements. We want to assure that people have certain rights, but we did that collectively. That wasn't ordained from somewhere. It didn't fall out of the sky. It was because human beings gathered and said, no, we want to commit to this collectively, right? So we need to do that, but we can do it out of a sense of aspiration and moving forward rather than a sense of entitlement and constantly like indicting humanity, indicting the past like we're so horrible. No, we're beings who are growing and evolving and thriving. And when we're not fearful, we do really good. So, how can we lower the fear and how can each one of us take responsibility for managing ourselves so we can add value to the collective and, and be as good of a participant in life as we possibly can.
I hope everyone is hearing choices out of what you're saying, that our choices make all the difference, and that you can stand from being inside a prison cell or outside preaching to that there is no lost causes, that we all have the ability to keep growing and keep changing and keep motivating and empowering. I feel like I see clientele or individuals who feel like, well, it's going to work for them, but it's just not going to work for me, and kind of settled into that. And you're pouring so much hope over everyone today. And I really thank you for that. As I look at your book and program, like, I'm going to read your title one more time: Radical Responsibility: How to Move Beyond Blame, Fearlessly Live Your Highest Purpose, and Become an Unstoppable Force for Good. What is your hope out of writing this book? Like, as we kind of start to wrap up today, what do you hope individuals heard out of you today? What would you hope their next action step would look like?
Well, you brought up choice, and this is really all about recognizing choice and living at choice. And I really, really hope that people would recognize that that is the doorway to freedom. Very often, when people hear about choice, it sounds like a burden, right? It sounds like, oh, I got to take on all this responsibility and choice. Well, it actually isn't. It's the doorway into freedom and joy and happiness. Because we just got to get over that, because we've all been enculturated and somehow, life should be easy and we're entitled to this and we're entitled to that. And life's hard. And so, any of us who are struggling, any of your listeners who are struggling, I feel it. I feel you. Life is hard, and it's challenging. And even when we're doing everything right, life is. I've been doing this work for a long time, and I've had some profound losses in my life. Right before my dad died 5 months before I got out of prison. One of my greatest hopes was to be out and have him see me free in the world. And he knew I was doing good. I think he knew I was going to be okay, but he didn't get to see me free. And then my mom died 5 months after I got out. And the woman who was really my best friend, we'd been involved in a relationship before I went to prison. She went on with her life, of course, and I wanted her to, and she was smart enough to do so. But when we got out, we were still very close friends. We were considering whether to, and then she died a year after I got out. I found another woman, the love of my life, that I was in partnership with. And basically, we would have gotten married eventually. We were together for 6 years. She died of cancer in 2008. Um, the same year, my son suffered a terrible head injury, and I thought he was never coming back from to be himself again, but he did finally, and so all that was going on, and then uh, very sadly and tragically, that eventually led through epilepsy and other things that I lost him, and he died 2 years ago. Um, I'm very grateful. I'm in a new relationship now with my wife, Sophie, and amazing. She is the love of my life, and we've been together for 6 years, and I'm very grateful and so much joy in my life. And I live with the sadness of having lost my son, right? So no matter what we do, life is challenging and life is hard, right? And sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's harder. So we need to have tremendous compassion for ourselves and tremendous compassion for others. But where the real joy and energy in life is really in embracing our choices. When we start really focusing on choice and the fact that we can, and that growth mindset, it brings so much energy. And we realize that, even though life is really hard, and can be really hard, life is also full of possibility and joy and amazement. It's a magical adventure. And it's really just a matter of shifting that mindset, and getting into that more positive growth mindset where we see life as a tremendous adventure, and we're just constantly picking ourselves up and getting back to it and doing the best we can.
You're so good. We're so lucky to have you today. Thank you so much for your time. Can you just let everyone know the easiest places to find you?
Sure. Well, I start off with my basic website, just fleetmaull.com, fleetmaull.com. If they want to check out some of my online courses and all the online summits I do, that's at heartmind.co. That's Heart Mind Institute, but the website is just heartmind.co. And if people happen to be interested in the prison work I do, that's prisonmindfulness.org. Oh, and also the book, you can check out the book at radicalresponsibilitybook.com, radicalresponsibilitybook.com, and you can download a free chapter there.
Awesome. Thank you again so much. Needed you today.
You're very welcome, Lindsay. Great to be with you.